Okay, welcome. So today we're going to be looking at a very important distinction in the history of early modern philosophy, one that we get from this colorful fellow right here, John Locke. In fact, we've seen versions of this line of thought already in the course. What we'll be learning today is Locke thinks that the color of an object, for instance, that's one quality, is not an objective property of an object in the same way that its shape or location is an objective property. Now, we've already seen this line of thought in our brief discussion of Galileo, and we also saw it in Descartes. But for a number of reasons, partly historical accident, but partly through the very precise way that Locke lays it out, Locke's way of thinking about the non-objectivity of colors has been adopted as the way of thinking about the non-reality, or the non-objectivity, I should say, of certain qualities. This is an important distinction, in fact. Locke does not believe that colors are an illusion or fake. He thinks that when you look, for instance, at an object, say this pencil that I'm holding right here, and I look at it and its greenness, we wouldn't want to attribute to Locke the view that the pencil is not actually green, or that you're fooling yourself when you believe that the pencil is green. But he will tell us that though this is a true statement, we wouldn't want to say that it's an objectively true statement, as the statements say this pencil is no more than 7 inches, or that it, what else could we say about it? That it is located in North Carolina, right? So we might say that what we're going to do here is to think about, well, what is it for something to be an objective property, and what might it be for something to be a less than objective property? So that's the plan for today. So I want to give a quick review of Locke's empiricist program, which will then lead us into corpuscularianism and a causal theory of perceptions. And then we'll talk about Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities, and we'll talk about how that distinction is supposed to work, and why it's important. So, just to recap, I've already got a video out on Locke's attack on innate ideas. So we'll be brief here, but it's important to remember that Locke is an empiricist, so he's going to claim that all the knowledge that you have, everything you could possibly ever know about reality, is based on experience. Through the processes of both sensation and reflection. And within this line of thought, he argues vigorously that there is no such thing as an innate idea. He's going to claim that every idea that you ever have will be traceable back to your sensory experience or your capacity for reflecting on your own mind. Last thing is that thought is essentially a conscious project, or a process for Locke. So, for instance, within his argument for empiricism, he spends a lot of time arguing that there is no such thing as a thought unthunk. Whereas Leibniz is willing to entertain the possibility of what we might call a petit perception, or a perception that evades our awareness. Locke does not leave room for that. It all comes down to experience, and experience is inherently experienced. Now, this empiricist line of thought is also closely related to a view sometimes called corpuscularianism. We actually saw this view already in Descartes, where Descartes said that all things in the material world reduce to matter. Unlike the Aristotelians, they think it's one kind of undifferentiated stuff, and we arrange it in different ways, and this is how we get the difference between, say, water and earth and fire. whereas the Aristotelians thought these were irreducible, fundamentally different kinds of things. So the corpuscularians say, look, no, we can actually do this more simply. All things reduce to one kind of matter. They thought it was infinitely divisible. So in this way, the corpuscularians actually differ from the atomists. Atomists think that at some point, material is not divisible anymore. But in any case, this corpuscularian view is this way of thinking about matter and reality in terms of arrangements of material parts in various ways that get us different effects. So I've got a little quote from a philosopher that Locke was very impressed with. Not just a philosopher, but what we might call a natural philosopher. Somebody who was building a theory of reality in conjunction with scientific experiments. And that's Robert Boyle. Now here's something that Boyle tells us. He says that a single particle of matter, by virtue of only two mechanical properties that belong to it, and I believe that he's going to be thinking about solidity and motion, probably. Well, once you have its solidity and motion diversified in so many ways, we get a vast number of variations, we may suppose capable by the compositions and recompositions of myriads of single individual corpuscles that may be contained and concreted in one body. So, for instance, we just have material stuff, and in order to get different things in the world, we arrange them differently. So we might say that ultimately, well, what's the difference between a dog and an iPhone? Well, it's not like they're made of fundamentally different kind of stuff. It's just that they are different ways of arranging matter and motion. So this is the way that the corpuscularian thinks. It is not the same as contemporary atomic theory, but it does foreshadow many of the basic points of contemporary atomic theory. Now, within this corpuscularian theory of material reality ties into what we might call a causal theory of perception. Remember, Locke says everything comes down to experience in the end. Well, as he puts it on page 314 of our reading, he says, bodies affect other things via impulse, right? And one thing that impulses of bodies do is they produce ideas in us. We might say, look, looking for an object on the desk, so what's going on with this coin that I'm holding in my hand? I can see it is a New York State coin. Well, we might say, how did I perceive that? Well, there are material events going on. We might say, look, some light is hitting the coin, it's bouncing off the coin in certain reflective ways, it's going into my eyes, and the light particles that are moving into my eyes are going to affect my eyes via impulse. That's a sort of more complicated story about matter and motion, right? So the photon hits the coin, moves off the coin, goes into my iris, then hits my retina, and that impulse then sets off certain motions, electrical signals in my brain that lead me to the sense perception that allows me to realize that this is a New York State quarter on my desk. So this is the theory that Locke is working with, right? So just to tie it together, we're going to be empiricists. Everything you know comes down to experience. Things really are just matter in motion arranged in various ways. And we come to learn about that matter in motion when that matter in motion hits us in the sense organs. Now, this is going to warm us up for our discussion of primary versus secondary qualities. Locke makes a really interesting observation. He says that there are some ideas that can be experienced only by one sense, whereas there are other ideas that can be identified through multiple senses. So here's the thought. Color is something that you cannot sense perceive. I mean, you cannot sense perceive it except for through your eyes, right? You can't smell a color. You can't feel a color. You can only identify the color of a thing by looking at it, right? Now we might say, for instance, that you could identify something by color by feeling it. So for instance, a blind person might have the color of their shirts stitched into the hem. So they might feel at the hem, and they feel with their fingers white, right? So they can tell that they're going to put on a white shirt instead of a black shirt. My understanding is this is what the singer Ray Charles did. He was blind, so he had codes stitched into his shirts so he could tell what kind he was wearing. But we might say that he's not really observing the color of the shirt. If he is truly blind, we might say he does not have access to color perception, and he's using this sort of inferential workaround to discover the color of his shirts. Right? You can only hear the sound of a thing from hearing. Right? So you could not look at something, with the microphone turned off and know what its sound is. Or there are other things like heat and solidity. Well, you can only recognize that something is hot by touching it. Even though you might infer that something is hot by seeing steam coming off of it, we can say that, for instance, that is not seeing that something is hot. It's simply inferring. The only way that you actually perceive hotness is through touch. Locke actually has a lengthy discussion of solidity. He says that this is the idea that we receive the most because we're all always being resisted by other things. He also distinguishes from Descartes. He thinks that solidity is more than extension because not only does it have a size. Remember, Descartes told us that extension is height and width and depth. Well, Locke is going to point out that solidity is more than just having mathematical dimensions, but it's also something that we sense. That you feel solidity, say, by sitting in the chair and having that chair push you back up. Okay, so there are some qualities of things that you can only perceive through one sense, but notice that there are some things that you can come to recognize that they are qualities of a thing, and you can perceive it through two senses. So one example is motion. Well, I can actually see that a thing is moving, but I can also feel with my body that a thing is moving, right? So if I am running this finger across the top of my hand, I am not only looking at what's going on and seeing that my finger is moving across the top of my other hand, but my hand was feeling it. It's also really interesting to notice that you can detect motion through hearing, right? So you might know about the Doppler effect. This is where, if a loud ambulance is blowing by quickly, you're just standing there, the ambulance will go that kind of shift in pitch. What's going on there is that as an ambulance moves towards you, the sound waves coming from it get bunched up, and when you have closer together sound waves, you get a higher pitch. And when it's moving away from you, then the sound waves get spaced out extra. And in that case, you get a lower pitch. So that's how you get that arc of pitch. And we can perceive that and realize that this is not a stationary ambulance. We can actually hear that the ambulance is moving. Right? Shape, right? I can perceive the shape of this coin by looking at it, but I can also perceive the shape of this coin by feeling it with my fingers. Right? Maybe you can even perceive number through hearing, right? So not only can I see or feel that there's more than one thing, but for instance, if I'm listening to a guitar being played, I can hear whether single notes or dual notes are being played in a moment. Good. Now, here's another suggestion that Locke makes. I'm going to mention it, and we'll problematize this idea later in the course. Some ideas you only get through reflection, and he says, you sense perceive like hardness and softness, coldness or hotness, and so on, but it's by reflecting on these ideas that you come to recognize that a thing has further qualities like existence, unity, that is being one and the same thing. So I might perceive this coin on a number of occasions and reflect and realize that it is the same coin over time. Sometimes we can perceive that things change over time. And he says that we can also perceive power, right? So he says, for instance, that you can perceive power in yourself, but you can also perceive changes happening in the world, and you can infer. You can reflect on these changes and recognize that, for instance, that, I don't know, gasoline lit with a match has the power to produce fire. Okay, now we're getting somewhere with Locke. So there are all these things that we can learn about the world through the senses. Well, now we're going to start to build our way up to the primary versus secondary distinction. Here's the first thing that Locke is going to tell us. He's going to say, when we're thinking about things and their features, we can talk about a thing's qualities. And a quality of a thing is just the powers of that thing to produce ideas in us. So when we think about, say, the qualities of this New York State quarter that I'm holding, we might say, well, it has the power to produce certain qualities in me. So it has certain features that cause me to believe that it is round, or that cause me to believe that it says Gateway to Freedom with a picture of the Statue of Liberty on it. So in this way, we're going to say that, look, it has a bunch of different qualities. There are ways that the thing is, but also, given the ways that it is, it can create a mental image for me. So now I have all these mental images. This is a New York State quarter that says Gateway to Freedom, that it is round, that it is silvery in color, and so forth. So anything has any number of qualities. You could also use the term property interchangeably here, but just remember that when we talk about a quality, it's less about its inherent nature as how it relates to us. Things have qualities when they can cause ideas in us. All right, now here's the big distinction. Some qualities are what Locke calls primary qualities. These are things that we might say are more inherent to the thing. So it is a power to produce an idea in us, but it is, we might think of as a permanent ability to create ideas in us. And Locke is going to say that these qualities remain in the body even when they are divided. So for instance, if I were to take the coin and cut it in half, it would still have certain qualities in it that would remain even if I chopped it up into little bits, right? We might say that, for instance, the mass of this coin, the mass that is in it now, even if I pulverize it into tiny little bits and make it into a fine, fine dust, and then I dissolve it in water, we might say that the mass of the coin hasn't disappeared, right? It's been dispersed, but it hasn't lost any mass. And we might say that the little parts are still solid in a certain way, they have a new shape, but they still have some shape. And there's still an answer to the question of whether these little pulverized bits of the coin are in motion. Right? So we're going to say, like, look, material objects are always going to be describable in terms of their solidity, their extension, their figure, and their mobility. All physical objects are going to inherently have these qualities. So for Locke, he's going to say, well, what are some of the qualities that are inherent to all material things? And he's going to say things like solidity, shape, extension, figure. Right? These are qualities that are always going to be directly in a thing. And they are, in an important way, inseparable. And in this way, he's going to call these qualities of things real qualities. Another way of thinking about the realness of these qualities is that they are objective, right? They are there whether or not anybody happens to be thinking about these qualities. This seems to be the most important definition of objectivity in most of the philosophical discussions that I've heard. It's this idea that for something to be objective, it's something that's there whether or not you like it and whether or not you're perceiving it in a certain way. So your perspective on an object doesn't change its shape or its mass. The shape and mass of an object are simply in the thing itself. And in this way, yeah, we can say, like, look, the primary qualities are in the bodies. So when I talk about the shape and mass of the coin, we're going to say that the shape and mass of the coin are built right into it. We might say they're part of the essence of that thing as an arrangement of corpuscles. Now, this is now where we get the distinction. What qualities of things, that is, what powers to produce ideas in us, are less than objective? Well, Locke is going to give us examples like color and sound and sweetness. So, whereas primary qualities are really in the bodies, you might say that the secondary qualities, we might say the color, the sound, and the sweetness, are not really in the bodies. So Locke is going to say that sound, well, that's not really in, say, a guitar string. Really what's going on there is the guitar string vibrates, right? And then it, moves a speaker, or it moves the wood in the guitar, and you get a sound, right? And that's vibrations moving through the air that then hit you in the ear. And we might say that the sound is a way that you are responding to certain vibrations, but it's not an inherent property of the guitar or the string or the speaker. He gives us some other examples. In fact, we saw some similar line of argument in Galileo, right? So Galileo told us that tickling is not really a quality of a feather, right? Being tickled is a quality of us that we then sort of project onto the feather itself. And Locke will make a similar argument. He's going to say, look, pain is not an inherent feature of fire, not in the same way that shape or location is an inherent feature of fire. He notes, for instance, that, well, if you stand at the right distance from a fire, it will feel pleasant and refreshing. But if you move too close to the fire, then it will just start to hurt. But we're not going to say that the pain is in the fire in the same way that shape or location is in the fire. Right? The shape and location are inseparable from that thing and the way it is now. The pain is just how we are responding to it. Locke gives us another example. He talks about manna. Locke was actually trained in physical medicine in a number of ways, and manna, in the context of early modern philosophy, was a substance that a person could eat in order to induce, sickness or nauseousness, let's say. But he's going to say that, well, what's really going on is there's not like sickness that's built into the manna. What's really going on there is that the manna is a certain way. It has some inherent features that are going to sit in your stomach the wrong way and cause you to feel sick. So one thing that Locke is going to notice here is that perception of a secondary quality is variable in a way that he thinks that our perception of a primary quality isn't. So, for instance, the same bowl of water can feel hot or cold, right? So, for instance, you might have a bowl of water, and this water might be lukewarm, right? And beside it is a bowl of ice water, and beside that is a bowl of hot water. We could put some steam coming off of this water, right? So now imagine that you were to take your hands, right, and you reach your hand over and you stick it one into the hot water. Now it's hot, but it's not so hot that you cannot stand it. It's just hot in a way that's like right on the edge of uncomfortable, right? And then you stick your other hand in the ice water. Let's say you're holding your hands in the ice water and the hot water for a full minute. So now your one hand is very hot and your other hand is very cold, right? Now what you're going to do is you're going to take those hands out of the unusually warm and cold water and you're going to stick them into the middle bowl with the lukewarm water. Well, what you'll find is that your hand that was in the ice water will start to feel like glowing and hot, right? Whereas the hand that was in the hot water might even feel kind of chilled, right? So we might say that there is no objective fact about how the lukewarm water is in terms of temperature. We might say instead that, well, what's going on here is like we are feeling whether something is hot or cold. And this is very variable perception. We've already looked at the example. Fire can be pleasant or painful depending on how close you are to it. So we would say that in that way, being pleasant or painful is not really information about the fire so much as it is information about how we are interfacing with it. Or one other example, so we can talk about sweetness, right? We might say that if you drink a glass of orange juice too soon after brushing your teeth, it will taste pleasantly sweet if you don't have a bunch of mint in your mouth, but it'll taste nasty and sour if you do have a mouthful of freshly brushed teeth. Right? So in this way, Locke is noticing that these qualities, like the way something feels hot or cold, or the way that something is pleasant or painful, or the way that something is sweet or sour, that's saying as much about the perceiver as it is saying something about the thing itself. Now, here's one objection you might raise, is you might say there is an objective temperature of this lukewarm water, right? We might just get a really good digital thermometer and stick it into that bowl of water, and we might say this water is 72 degrees. And then you might also give me a theory of what it is for something to be hot. You might, for instance, tell me that, well, your physics teacher in high school taught you that to be hot is to have the particles in it vibrating to a certain extent. And the more vibration we have in the particles, the more it gets like the hot water, the more it gets like the ice water. Locke is going to say, oh yeah, he agrees with that. So there is an objective way that things come to be hot, right? But when we start talking in the language of particles in a location vibrating, we've actually switched to primary quality talk, right? So part of what Locke is going to say here is that every secondary quality, every power to produce an idea in us that is variable, will actually be explained by certain primary qualities. So another way that we would put this in Locke's term is that the arrangement of, say, corpuscles and how they are moving is going to make the difference between whether something is hot or cold. We might also say whether it's sweet or sour. So we might say that with the toothpaste and orange juice example, it might be that, well, your taste buds are functioning differently when there is still a remnant of toothpaste in your mouth, right? Now, you might ask, well, how is this a theory of objective versus non-objective properties? Well, here's going to be our next step. Locke is going to say that when we start talking about hotness, we're not always talking about like the vibrating particles, right? Most of the time, we're talking about how things feel, right? So when I say something is hot, well, I'm talking about, the hot weather, for instance, is a judgment from my perspective of what it feels like to be outside, for instance. Here's another one. We can point out that you can change the qualities of things. You can change the power of it to bring about certain perceptions in you by changing primary qualities. So he gives the example of an almond, right? So you take an almond and, you take the almond. Here's my drawing of an almond. It doesn't look that much different from like a drawing of a football, but it is a crunchy nut in the shape of an oval, right? Now, here's what happens. You're going to put it in your mortar and pestle, and out of it, you're going to mash it up, bash it up, and you're going to turn it into almond butter. Let's assume that this was a skinned almond, so it was basically white in color. Now that I've mashed it up, it's kind of brown and oily, right? So I've basically gone from having a nut, I mashed it up, and now I've turned it into a nut butter, right? Well, Locke points out with this example, it goes from being crunchy and having one particular relish, one particular flavor, and it goes to being oily instead of crunchy, and it gets a new flavor, right? Like the flavor of an almond is quite different from the flavor of almond butter, right? And he's going to say that we have new qualities, right? The qualities of having flavor, X instead of flavor Y. And we can also say that it is oily instead of crunchy now. Well, that is ultimately due to changes in the solidity, arrangement of the initial particles. So even though many things about the nut stays the same, so for instance, it's still made of the same stuff and it essentially still has the same mass, but we've changed some of the real qualities of the body that gets us different perceptual experiences of the same nut. Bear with me in the technology. But now that we think about this, we can say that the central test for a quality's being a secondary quality, here's how Locke puts it. He says that the secondary quality, much like what he also calls imputed qualities, which are but the powers of several combinations of the primary ones. So when you mash the almond into nut butter, you have recombined some of its primary qualities, its arrangements of corpuscles, But these changes are going to operate on our mind without being distinctly discerned, by which we may also come to know what ideas are and what are not resemblances or something really existing in bodies we denominate from them. That's a bit of a mouthful, but here's maybe a hint or a key, right? We're going to say, look, sometimes you change something in an object in the way that it really is, and we get a different sensory experience. So for instance, if you are a music listener, if you change a vibration from 440 hertz to 880 hertz, well, that's a doubling. That's going to get you an octave up, right? So you're going to change your note. But you're not actually perceiving the vibrations one by one. It's not like you count the first 440 vibrations per second, and then you move up to like counting each of the 880 vibrations per second. Instead, what happens is you hear the note A, and then you hear the note A an octave up, right? So you're not distinctly discerning every single vibration. Or go back to the heat example, right? We might say that you are getting more vibration of the molecules when you turn up the heat of some water in your kettle, but it's not like you're actually looking at the molecules and seeing them vibrate. No, like we cannot look at water on a molecule by molecule basis or feel water on a molecule by molecule basis. But when water is behaving in certain ways at the molecular level, it's going to affect our sense organs and cause us to have a certain kind of experience. So you're just looking at the water and, it goes from hot to cold. You're not actually seeing the molecules slow down. You're just perceiving it started hot and now it's cold, right? So basically, these are powers of, indiscernible changes in an object, which then appear to us in a certain way, like an experienced temperature change. Now, here's the other thing, is that our experience of a temperature change does not resemble what's actually going on in the water. Because the feeling of hot and cold, that's not a mental image of molecules slowing down for us, right? So we're getting the idea of coldness coming out of a hot thing, but we are not getting the idea of molecules slowing down. So this is actually going to give us Locke's central test. If our ideas of a thing resemble the way that it really is, then the qualities giving rise to those ideas are primary qualities. So going back to my New York State quarter here, we're going to say, this quarter is round from one angle and flat from another angle. We might say that when I sense perceive it, I am getting a mental image. And we might say that there is a resemblance relationship between my mental image of the quarter and the quarter itself, right? So we would say that roundness has a resemblance relation from thing to idea, right? And because that's the case, we have a resemblance between what we're perceiving and how our perception appears to us. That resemblance relationship is going to count this as a primary quality. But if our ideas of a thing fail to resemble the way that it really is, then the qualities giving rise to those ideas, are secondary qualities, right? So, as we said, right, my idea of hotness is an experience, right? But that idea doesn't have a resemblance relationship to vibrations of particles, right? And in that way, we would say that those vibrations of particles are real qualities. But because our experience of those qualities is so different from what's actually going on, that's going to be a secondary quality. There's a failure of resemblance. So here's the idea. Secondary qualities do not resemble the objects that cause these qualities. Here's another way of putting it. Secondary qualities lack isomorphism with their causes. So here's an example, just to keep you thinking here. We might say that a map of North Carolina is isomorphic with North Carolina itself. So here's a little sketch of the great state of North Carolina, something like that, right? Now we might say that this is what I've drawn, it's a map, and we could say that here's one thing that we can say about it. You know, Greensboro on the map of North Carolina might be right about there. And we might say that Chapel Hill is right about there. And we might also say that, you know, in the north and the west, that's where Boone is. So we might say, I've just made you a little map of North Carolina here. Now, we might say that there is an isomorphism between this map that I've just drawn and the state of North Carolina itself, right? So if you think about the location of the actual cities in this state, you might actually realize that Greensboro is, you know, in between, not a perfect halfway between, but, you know, it's, you know, 1 hour from Chapel Hill and maybe about 2 hours from Boone, right? So in this way, we might say that the betweenness of Greensboro on the map is isomorphic to the betweenness of the things themselves that the map represents, right? So we can say that there are certain representations of the world that have this isomorphism, right? Isomorphism, just from the Greek, right? Iso means equal, morph means form. So we might say that the form of the idea is going to have a matching relationship to the forms of the things represented in the idea. And here's where Locke is going to go with this. He's going to say that our ideas of the shape of an object would also have a resemblance relationship or an isomorphism with the object itself. So we can think about the coin itself, and we can think about my ideas of the coin. And we might say that there is a isomorphic, or you might even say a mapping relationship between my mental representation of the coin shape and the way that the coin really is, right? So because we have this isomorphism, we have a primary quality. Now, compare that to our idea of an object's color. Like, think about what the color of an object really is. Well, for an object to have a certain color, what's going on is, you know, we've got an object. It is a red object. Let's say, I'm going to have to get a little creative here with, you know, we might say that this object is hit with white light. It's going to absorb the other colors, but then red light is going to come off that object, and it's going to, you know, that red light is going to come off the object and hit me in the eye, and that's going to send a signal to my brain. Now, what we might actually say is that what's really going on with this red light is less so that it's got redness inherent in it, but rather that it is light with a very particular wavelength, right? And we would say that, for instance, the wavelength of this light, when it hits my retina, it's going to trigger certain rods and cones, which only after hitting certain rods and cones is it going to give rise to an idea of a red thing. Strange little diagram here, but we might say that it would actually be a mistake. So forgive my drawing a red object. Really what we have is full spectrum light coming in, hitting the object, reflecting out light with a certain wavelength. That's going to hit the eye, and then it's going to give rise to an idea, right? So what is it actually to be red? Well, it is to be a thing that reflects light of a certain wavelength to certain observers when the object is in ordinary white light, right? So we would say that our idea, so that's a little thought bubble here, our idea of the color of a thing is quite different from what the color actually is. So because we don't have a matching isomorphism between our experience of the thing and what it really is, we're going to say that's a secondary quality. So this is another way of talking about resemblance, right? So when there is isomorphism between the object and idea, then the idea represents the object for what it really is. And so the roundness of this coin is going to cause ideas that represent the roundness of the coin through an isomorphic resemblance relationship. But for colors, there is no object idea isomorphism. And in that way, we do not represent the idea for what it really is, but instead we are representing it through a peculiar perspective of our particular sense organs. So we might ask, why is this primary-secondary distinction important? Well, I think that one thing that we can say is that it helps to answer Locke's question that we started with in his attack on innate ideas. And this is the question about the bounds of knowledge, right? What things are knowable and what things are just matters of opinion? Well, it's going to say that there are some things that have objective answers, right? Questions that can be reduced to questions about matter in motion, corpuscles and certain arrangements, right? So it gives us a picture of what objective reality is, and it's also going to give us a theory of how we come to know about it, right? So for instance, we get it through sensory contact, and we'll also realize that primary qualities can be perceived through more than one sense organ, right? So motion is a primary quality, and I can represent motion both visually and through touch and auditorily, right? So in that way, things impacting our sense organs is going to explain how we could come to know about the objective corpuscularian features that are really in a thing. Last thing is that Locke is going to say within the bounds of knowledge, there are some questions that don't really have an objective answer, right? So whether something is hot, we could talk about the vibrating particles for sure. We could even stick a thermometer into the object and get a reading off of it. That's true enough. But if we're answering a question like, is the hot tub too hot? Or is this soup too spicy? To a certain extent, those are questions about the secondary qualities of these things, and we should actually admit a bit of leeway for variability in perception. Because, perceptions of warmth or spiciness, well, these might actually be subjective reads from particular observers rather than, an answerable question about the way that things really are, right? So maybe we could argue until the cows come home about whether a certain shade that we're looking at is more of an orange or more of a red, right? Ultimately, Locke can say that these might be perceptions that are variable, and until we try to reduce these questions to questions about primary qualities, there may not be an objective answer. In this way, this is a valuable thing to notice, because Locke is going to say, look, beings that have sense experience, there are some things that we can and cannot know, and there are some questions we can and cannot settle. By noting what we're really talking about when we talk about primary qualities, these qualities that are really in an object, well, these are things that have objective answers. And to that extent, Locke is going to encourage us to focus on these qualities of things when we argue about what reality really is like. The secondary qualities are important for us to navigate the world, but in a certain sense, the answer to whether something really has a secondary quality could be a matter of dispute that is irresolvable. But I'll leave you to reflect on this distinction. We will challenge it and problematize it as we continue on. But at this point, the main thing to notice is this distinction between what is really in a body and what is not really in a body, and this other key idea of resemblance. Is there an object-idea isomorphism? If it is, then we have a primary quality. Or do we have a non-resemblance relationship between the things as they really are and our ideas as we experience them? So, thanks for listening in. Take care, and I'll talk to you later.